Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, to our study of the Gospel according to Luke. Today we are going to deal with the first part of chapter 23. We'll divide this into two parts because the first section of chapter 23 in the book of Luke deals with the interrogations of Jesus before Pilate and Herod. Then next time we will talk about the last half of chapter 23, which deals with the crucifixion of Jesus. I am going to call these appearances before Jewish and Roman authorities as interrogations. They are often called trials, the trials of Jesus. But they were anything other than legitimate trials, and so let's call them, for now at least, interrogations. There are three appearances of Jesus before the Jews who had arrested him. He appeared before Annas. Annas was a former high priest who was still recognized by many of the Jews as being the legitimate one to own that position during his lifetime. Annas spoke with Jesus in John chapter 18, verses 12 to 14, and verses 19 to 24. Jesus was then taken to Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the official high priest at that time and the one in charge of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, of course, met. It was the high court of the Jews, and so Jesus appeared before the Sanhedrin prior to being taken before the Romans. The Jewish interrogations of Jesus were based on ecclesiastical concerns, and the charge that came out of those interrogations was that Jesus had been guilty of blasphemy. He was taken to the Romans because the Roman authorities required Jews to have permission from the governor to execute a person. Capital punishment was not a free right among the Jews at that time. So the Roman authorities interrogating Jesus were doing so in a civil capacity rather than an ecclesiastical one. Jesus was taken first to Pilate, then to Herod, and that's Herod Antipas, and then back to Pilate. So you can see there are three periods of interrogation among the Jews and three periods of interrogation by the Romans. Many years ago, an attorney by the name of Walter Chandler, a member of the New York Bar, wrote a book called The Trial of Jesus. He had been interested in how the Jews had arrested and handled Jesus before his crucifixion. And so he studied the Jewish law in the Mishnah and in the Old Testament, actually. He made several points that I thought it would be good for us to note, just to see the hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders of that day. Jesus had accused them of being hypocrites all along, and they prove it by the way that they handled the arrest and the trial of Jesus. First of all, point one, the arrest of Jesus was illegal under the law and the practices of the Jews of that day. The arrest was effected through the agency of a traitor and an informer, and that should have made it suspect to any legitimate court. The arrest was not the result of a legal mandate from a court, whose intentions were to effect a legal trial. So Jesus was unfairly arrested. Point two, the private examination of Jesus before Annas or Caiaphas was illegal. There was no sitting judge sitting alone to examine or judge the accused and provide him his rights. And there was no private preliminary or examination of the accused. That was not allowed, but it was allowed under the law. Point number three, the indictment against Jesus was in its form illegal. The accusation was vague, it was indefinite, and it was duplicitous. It was not true at all. The accusation was in part made by Caiaphas, who was himself one of the judges of Jesus. Hebrew law forbade any but leading witnesses to present the charge, to make the accusation. It was not good for the judge to have already judged. Point number four, the proceedings of the Sanhedrin against Jesus were illegal because they were conducted at night. All such cases should be judged in the open daylight of a day. Point number five, under Jewish law, the proceedings of the Sanhedrin against Jesus were illegal because the court convened before the offering of the morning sacrifices. According to their rules of practice, they should have waited until after the sacrifices were offered in the morning to convene the court. Point number six, the proceedings against Jesus were illegal because they were conducted on the day preceding a Jewish Sabbath. Also, it was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it was the eve of the Passover. Point number seven, the trial was illegal because it was concluded within one day. Jewish law said that in all capital cases there must be a review on the following day before an execution could take place. Point number eight, the sentence of condemnation pronounced against Jesus by the Sanhedrin was illegal because it was founded upon uncorroborated and conflicting testimony concerning his supposed confession of wrongdoing. That was illegal among the Jews. The evidences had to be presented by consistent witnesses and more than one, and they had to agree. Point number 9. The condemnation of Jesus was illegal because the verdict was unanimous. Jewish law required at least one vote of innocence in the Sanhedrin for the sake of mercy. There had to be someone who would show mercy toward the victim or toward the defendant in the case. In this case, the verdict was unanimous. Point number 10, the proceedings against Jesus were illegal in that, 1, the sentence of condemnation was pronounced in a place forbidden by the law. They left the hall of judgment where the condemnation should have been pronounced. And 2, the high priest rent his clothes. He was not supposed to do that. He was not supposed to show that he disagreed in some way with the verdict. And the balloting was irregular. There was a system of balloting in capital cases, and this was not followed in this particular case. Point number 11, the members of the Great Sanhedrin were legally disqualified to try Jesus. They were chosen, and their positions were dependent upon the choices of Roman officials, not duly chosen within the Jewish community where they should have been. And then point number 12, the condemnation of Jesus was illegal because the merits of the defense were not considered. Jesus did not really have an opportunity to respond himself to the accusations, not at least a good opportunity. Well, I wish we had time to go into each of those, and Chandler did in his book, but they show, as we've said, the hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders in wanting to take Jesus out of the scene of influence among their followers. Well, let's go now to the text of chapter 23. These events took place prior to Jesus' appearance before Pilate. In verse 1 of our text, then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Then Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him and said, "It is as you say." The whole multitude of them, that phrase, refers to those who arrested Jesus. It was a Jewish contingency, including Sanhedrin and their supporters. Matthew and Mark both tell us that they bound Jesus to take him to Pilate. By Roman orders, they went to Pilate for approval to execute Jesus, as we have said earlier. Pontius Pilate was the procurator of Samaria and Judea at this time. We sometimes call that the governor. That word is a legitimate synonym for procurator in their terminology. He was governor from 26 to 36 AD, a period of about 10 years. Pilate managed the Roman military in Israel. He managed the imperial taxation, the taxation that went to Rome, the Roman taxation. He managed deciding major civil and criminal cases that were of consequence among the Jews. Most cases were left to the Jews to be handled, but as in capital cases, he would have to decide whether the person could be executed. He also managed major building projects, and they were several during this period of a decade. Roads were to be taken care of, aqueducts bringing water to the people, city developments, even new towns or the naming of towns in Israel by the Romans were in his hands. So Pilate had some major responsibilities in the land. He also had some major conflicts with the Jews. It would be good if we had time to go into details regarding these, but on one occasion, Pilate brought effigies of Tiberius into Jerusalem and threatened to kill those who protested their appearance there. He backed off from actually slaying those who saw themselves as anti-idolaters, but politically it was disastrous to him. He used temple funds to build an aqueduct to which the Jews objected. And in Luke chapter 13 at verse 1, we are told he mingled some Galileans' blood with their sacrifices. So he conflicted with the Jews on several occasions that were major and caused them to hate him. Pilate was generally motivated by political expediency. And we see that in the case of Jesus, when his wife advised him to have nothing to do with Jesus, that's recorded in Matthew chapter 27, and when he gave in and washed his hands of the blood of Jesus, giving in to the Jewish religious leaders. The end of Pilate's rule in Israel came with trouble in Samaria. Pilate sent soldiers to deal with a false prophet who claimed to recover sacred vessels hidden by Moses on Mount Gerizim. Pilate's soldiers slaughtered Samaritan followers of this fraudulent person, but the people of Samaria appealed to the legate in Syria, and as a result, Pilate was recalled to Rome. Pilate later fell out of favor with Caligula, the new emperor, and he committed suicide. Question has been raised why Pilate was in Jerusalem at the time of the crucifixion of Christ. Surely it must have been better for him, by hindsight, not to have been there at all. Perhaps he wanted to make a special appearance at their feast. Perhaps he wanted to manage disturbances and handle Roman interest during the feast. Remember, there were thousands of people in the city during the Passover. Perhaps he just wanted to observe the special festivities of the time. At any rate, he was there, and Jesus was taken to him. You will notice as you read this account, both in chapter 26 and in chapter of Matthew and in chapter 23 of the book of Luke, the charges against Jesus are quite ambiguous, non-specific, and non-supported by the facts. In the Jewish company, dealing with their accusations against Christ, the charge was blasphemy. As we have said, it was an ecclesiastical or a religious charge. Of course, a religious charge before the Romans would not carry much weight, not from Jewish religious position at least. So, before the Romans, our passage tells of the charges that were against him. Luke 23, verses 1, 2, and 3. The first charge was subversion or sedition. Notice they say, "We found this fellow perverting the nation." Again, that's a subjective thing, very ambiguous. It was a generic charge. He was harming the nation, perverting the nation. And then, secondly, the charge was insurrection. The charge was forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Of course, Jesus had not done that. In fact, he had said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and the things that are God's to God." So he was not guilty of the charge of insurrection against the government. And the third charge was treason. They said that he was saying that he himself is Christ a king. That would be treason against the Roman emperor at least, wouldn't it? And perhaps even against Herod. Well, Pilate asked Jesus about his claim to be the king. Jesus responded to the questioning by explaining the spiritual nature of his kingdom. When he was asked by Pilate, "Are you the king?" he said, "It is as you say." He had just said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." He's trying to explain the spiritual nature of his kingdom to Pilate. He said this before Pilate's question, "Are you then a king?" And John reports then that Jesus responded, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." So he addresses the question by trying to explain to Pilate that he is a different kind of king than what he is being accused of treasonously being. So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." he seemed to have gotten that Jesus was not guilty of insurrection against the government. He said, "I find no fault in this man. From a civil and a legal point of view, he found no fault." But they were the more fierce, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place." Pilate still found no fault that would bring him to cause him to be executed. As a matter of fact, Jesus was found to have unanimous verdict of innocence with regard to the charges against him. Consistently, the text is clear that Jesus was not guilty of crimes that should have been true if he were to be executed and put to death, particularly put to death in the manner in which he was. Judas, Pilate's wife, Pilate on 3 occasions confirms that he found no fault in Jesus. He was innocent. Herod, the criminal on the cross, next to Jesus' cross, and the centurion, the Roman centurion at the cross, all knew that Jesus was innocent of crimes that would put him to death. Well, Pilate heard that Jesus was from Galilee, and so he asked if this man were a Galilean, verse 6. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, Herod Antipas ruled Galilee, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. This Herod is Antipas. He was married to Herodias, his brother's wife, his half-brother's wife, you remember, and he was the executioner of John the Baptist. That had taken place earlier during Jesus' ministry. Herod Antipas had heard rumors about Jesus, and he remembered John the Baptist, according to Matthew. Jesus did not respond to him at all. Well, verse 11 says, "Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. Jesus had told the disciples that he would be mocked, insulted, spit upon, scourged, and killed. We looked at that in Luke chapter 18. They ridiculed Jesus in all of these ways, and they put an elegant robe on him, mocking his claim to be a king. Pilate had at least publicly shown respect for Herod by sending Jesus to him for his input. Perhaps that's the basis of their renewed friendship. It may have been a very superficial thing or a political thing that Pilate did in this case to get Jesus away from himself and to relieve the responsibility upon him. But it put both of them in the same dilemma with regard to Christ. Well, verse 13 then tells us that Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man." You see, again, he says that. "I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod. For I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him." What a strong statement, indicating how Pilate should have treated Jesus. He saw no criminal laws broken by Jesus at all. He says they had accused Jesus of misleading the people, but he also saw no evidence of that, at least not in the charges they had made against Jesus. So Pilate said, verse 16, "I will therefore chastise him and release him." For it was necessary for him to release one of them at the feast. And they all cried out at once, saying, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas," who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city, and for murder. To placate the insistent priests and scribes, Pilate offers a compromise. Morally and legally, Pilate should have released Christ. Instead, he offered Barabbas, an offer associating Jesus with a criminal, and perhaps giving him some right to scourge Jesus, to punish him before he released him. Verse 20 says, "Pilate therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them." He wanted not to allow the execution, at least at this point he did. But they shouted, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." And then he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him." That's the third time he said that. "I will therefore chastise him and let him go." But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. Pilate wanted to punish Jesus for arousing such a problem, but to release him before executing him. They demanded the most abusive, humiliating, brutal torture imaginable. Next study, we will take a look at some of that. So Pilate gave sentence, verse 24, that it should be as they requested. Politically, that was the thing he thought he should do. Morally, it was terrible. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison. But he delivered Jesus to their will. In Matthew 27 at verse 16, Barabbas is called a notable prisoner. He was apparently notorious, well known among the Jews. In Mark 15 at verse 7 and Luke 23 verse 19, he had been implicated in some insurrection, a sedition, an uprising, perhaps a riot or revolt in the city of Jerusalem, and had committed what was known to the Romans as murder. In John 18, verse 40, he is represented as a robber. So he's a notable prisoner. He had committed robbery and murder. He was a thief and he was a murderer. Pilate was in a dilemma. He could execute an innocent man and avoid a riot, he thought, or he could release him with justice and cause a riot. What would he do? He tried to compromise. Have Jesus flogged. Instruct him to quit teaching and preaching as he was against what the Jews thought was their law. Appease their demands. The choice ultimately came down to a man, Barabbas, who was a murderer, who had shed blood, versus the Son of God, who was giving his blood for mankind. It is difficult to know who Barabbas actually was. Was he a Jew? His name, sometimes thought to be Bar, son of Abba, father, was a Jewish name. What was his ethnic background? Was he Jewish? Was he half Jew? Was he not Jewish at all? Some say, as we've already said, Bar Abba would be Jewish. Others say Arab is included in his name, and thus he was Arabic and not Jewish at all. Origen reports that in several manuscripts of the Gospels he had seen, the name was given as Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus the son of Abba. Accordingly, the first name was afterward omitted from the manuscripts of the Gospels when the name of Jesus had become sacred, Origen said. Not much evidence other than that given by Origen himself, an ancient scholar, on that. Jerome, another of what are called sometimes the church fathers, in commenting on Matthew chapter 27, verse 16, quotes the Gospel of the Hebrews as containing the explanation of Barabbas as a son of a teacher, Bar, son, Rabbi, or rabbi. and gives that as the reason that he, being the son of a rabbi or teacher, he was popular among the people and they were willing to forgive him. This assumes that Abba is used in the name Barabbas as a common noun, whereas Abba is found as a name very early. According to the New Testament, there was a custom to release, at the request of the people on the day preceding the festival of Passover, one prisoner condemned to punishment. When they were given the choice between Barabbas and Jesus after the latter had been condemned, they selected Barabbas, possibly on the ground that he had been engaged in an insurrection against the Romans, but more probably because they hated Jesus and saw Jesus as being more dangerous than Barabbas. They wanted Jesus dead. And with Pilate, at least, they prevailed. Well, that's our study for today. We'll look at the second half of Luke chapter 23 in our study next week, and it includes the record, according to Luke, of the crucifixion of Christ. I hope that you have a blessed day today, and we will look forward to studying with you again.